Chapter 8. Rumours abounded regarding the mysteries lurking behind the gaily painted front door of 15 Sprite Street. Strange noises had been heard in the nights, coming as from the bowels of the earth, weird rumblings and vibrations. Cats gave Soap's backyard a wide berth, and the milkman would venture no further than the front gate. How this ordinary little house had managed to gain such notoriety had always been beyond OMalley's understanding. Believing as he did that Soap was little more than a buffoon, the way in which his neighbours avoided him and even crossed over the street before reaching his house had the Irishman baffled. Pooley, to whom most doors swung open one way or another, had never yet managed to cross the portal, although he had employed many devious devices. He could probably have persuaded even Cerberus to leave his post and go off in search of a few dog biscuits. Soap had always been impervious, thus it came as something of a shock to find himself and OMalley now standing in the tiny front garden, while Soap shushed them into silence and felt about in his pockets for the key. "Now," said Soap in a voice of deadly seriousness, "before you enter, I must ask that all you may see within must never be divulged to another living soul." Pooley, who had been in the Scouts for a day, raised 2 fingers to his forehead and said, "Dip, dip, dip." OMalley, who was finding it hard to keep a straight face, licked his thumb and said, "See this wet, see this dry, cut my throat if I tell a lie." Soap shrugged. "I suppose I could expect no more. Now come, step carefully, because the light will not function until the front door is closed and bolted from within." He turned the key and pushed the door open into the Stygian darkness within. "You seem somewhat security-conscious, Soap," said OMalley. Invisibly in the darkness, Soap tapped his nose. "One cannot be too careful when one is keeper of the great mystery." Pooley whistled. "The great mystery, eh?" Soap threw the bolt, made several inexplicable clicking noises with what seemed to be switches, and suddenly the room was ablaze with light. "My God!" said OMalley, in a voice several octaves higher than usual, as the 2 stood blinking in the brightness. Soap studied their faces with something approaching glee. These were the first mortals other than himself ever to see his masterwork, and their awe and bewilderment were music to his eyes. "What do you think, then?" OMalley was speechless. Pooley just said, "By the gods!" The wall dividing the front room from the back parlour had been removed along with all the floorboards and joists on the ground floor. The section of flooring on which the 3 now stood was nothing more than the head of a staircase which led down and down into an enormous cavern of great depth, which had been excavated obviously with elaborate care and over a long period of time. A ladder led up to the bedroom, the staircase having been long ago removed. OMalley stared down into the blackness of the mighty pit, which yawned below him. "Where does it go to?" he asked. "Down," said Soap. "Always down, but also around and about." "I must be going now," said Pooley. "Must be up and making an early start. Lots to do." "You've seen nothing yet," said Soap. "This is only the entrance." OMalley was shaking his head in wonder. "You dug this, then?" "No, not just me," Soap laughed disturbingly. "My great-grandfather began it shortly after the house was built. The lot then fell to my grandfather and down the line to me, last of the distance and guardian of the great mystery." "It's madness," said OMalley. "The whole street will collapse." Soap laughed again. "No, never. My family have the know, as it were. They worked upon the Thames Tunnel back in the days of Brunel." "But that collapsed." "Never. That's what the authorities said. The truth was that the navigators who dug that ill-fated pit stumbled upon an entrance to the worlds beneath, and the tunnel had to be closed hurriedly, and an excuse found to please the public." "You mean your old ones actually met up with these folk below?" "Certainly." "Shall we go down, then?" said Soap. Pooley said, "I'll wait here." "I invited you in for a drink, and a drink you're going to have." "I think I'm no longer thirsty," said Jim, "and after this I think I might take a vow of abstinence." "God!" said OMalley. "Don't say such a thing, even in jest." "Come on, then," said Soap. "I will lead the way. It's not far to the first chamber." "First chamber?" "Oh, yes. The caverns lead down into the bowels of the earth, and subsidiary tunnels reach out in all directions, some for several miles at a stretch." Soap flicked several more switches and led the way down a long flight of steps which reached downward into the darkness. As they descended, the way before them sprung into light, and the pathway behind fell into darkness. "Clever that, eh?" said Soap. "An invention of my great-grandfather's. Don't ask me how it works, because I don't know." "Must save some money on the electricity bill," said Jim. Electric bill? Soap gave another of his hideous laughs, which boomed along the corridors and down into the pit, returning in ghostly echoes back to them. I'm tapped directly into the grid. I've never paid for gas or electric as long as I've lived. Jim shook his head in dismay. This is unreal, said he. How can all this exist and nobody know about it? And what did you and your forefathers do with the earth from these diggings? Ah, ha, 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 said Soap, having another tap at his nose. Ha, 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 ha. At length they reached a vaulted chamber. Pooley later reckoned it must have been about 50 yards in diameter, but it was impossible to tell for certain, as the lighting was only evident at whichever spot they stood. Now, about this wine, Soap said. The temperature here is ideal for hocks, border roses, Rhine wines, sweet sherry, and growing mushrooms. From an enormous wine rack, Soap withdrew a dusty-looking bottle, and having no corkscrew readily at hand, punched in the cork with his thumb. Bottoms up, he said, taking an enormous swig. He passed the bottle to OMalley. Try it. It's a 50-year-old vintage. OMalley took a small, indecisive sip, smacked his lips a few times, took a great swig, and then one very, very large swig. It is indeed good stuff, said he, wiping his sleeve across his mouth and passing the bottle to Jim Pooley. Jim, who had watched the Irishman's performance with interest, needed no telling twice. He put the bottle to his lips and drew off a long and satisfying draught. Very shortly now, said Soap, accepting the bottle from Pooley and finishing it off, very shortly now, contact will be made. I may be only inches away. OMalley nodded, his eyes wandering over the wine rack. Soap pulled out another bottle and punched in the cork. Feel free, he said. OMalley felt free. I have all the ancient maps, you see. My forebears knew the locations, and they knew it was the work of several generations. But now I am there. The moment is close at hand. Mankind stands poised upon the brink of the greatest of all discoveries, the new golden age, the dawn of the new tomorrow. Soap's voice was rising in pitch. John OMalley took another hasty pull upon the bottle and passed it hurriedly to Jim. We'd best get going, old pal. I have a feeling I know what's coming, he whispered. Soap was stalking about the cavern, arms raised, ranting at the top of his voice. Jim and John watched in stunned silence as the haunting light followed him from place to place, eerily illuminating his frantic motions. As he drew further from them, his voice faded as if absorbed into the rock. His staccato movements and dramatic gestures lent to him the appearance of some bizarre mime artiste acting out an inexplicable saga beneath the travelling spotlight. Soap lurched over to the wine rack and popped the cork from another bottle of wine. Here, he said. Here, I'll show you the legacy of the distance. I'll show you. We'll take your word for it, said OMalley. We really must be making a move now, Jim added in a convincing tone which concealed the fact that he was having great difficulty in controlling his bladder. No, you are here, the only ones. You must be present when the portals are unlocked. You cannot be allowed to leave. That's what I thought was coming, muttered OMalley. This way. With the wine bottle bobbing on his hand and the eerie light shining about him, Soap made his way rapidly down a side corridor, leaving Pooley and OMalley in the darkness. I cannot remember by which entrance we came into this place, said John. I've no idea as to that myself, Jim replied, and I am beginning to feel very poorly. Vintage wine and Neville's large making a poor cocktail. I fear we must follow him or stand alone in the darkness, said John, for the trick of light apparently works only to his account. Jim wondered if magnetism might play some part in the situation, but now seemed a bad time for idle speculation, so he shrugged his shoulders in the darkness, and the two set off to follow the glowworm figure of Soap distant as it moved away in front of them. I estimate, although it is impossible to be certain, that we must be somewhere beneath the London Road, said John. I have the same feeling myself, Jim replied, but I hope you realise and will record upon some tablet or graven plaque, even though it may be my own memoriam, that this whole thing is utterly fantastic and totally impossible. Certainly these caverns appear to be the work of no earthly spade. I think that somewhere back along the bloodline of a distance, someone must have discovered this place by chance, although as to its original purpose and its manner of excavation, that is unimaginable. Come quickly now, screamed Soap, shining up ahead. We're nearly there. Of a sudden they came to a halt, the tunnel terminating unexpectedly in what appeared to be a pair of massive iron doors. You see, see!" screamed Soap. O'Malley noted that beads of perspiration were rolling down his forehead, and that evil lines of white foam extended from the corners of his mouth and vanished beneath his chin. You see, the holy portal!" O'Malley approached the gigantic doors. They were obviously of great age and looked capable of holding back the force of several armies. In the ghost light he could make out the heads of enormous rivets running in columns from top to bottom, and what appeared to be a large yet intricately constructed mechanism leading from two wheels that looked like the stopcocks on some titanic plumbing system. Central to each door was a brass plaque bearing upon it a heraldic device of uncertain origin. It was the wheels that drew O'Malley's attention. There was something hauntingly familiar about them, and he tried to recall where he had seen them before. As he stepped forward, Soap Distant barred his way. "No, no!" he screamed. "You may not touch. It is for me. I, the last in line. I who must fulfill the prophecies. I who must open the portal." "Soap," said John seriously. "Soap, I do not feel that you should open these doors. Something tells me that it would be a grave mistake." Pooley nodded wildly. "Best leave them, Soap, and can't just go unlocking every door you come to." Soap turned and ran his hands over the pitted surface of the iron doors. "I think," said John, who was fast realising the gravity of this particular situation, "I think, Soap, that if you're adamant about this door-opening business, then it would be better for you to be alone at the moment of opening. It'd be wrong of us to stand around looking on. If the prophecies say what you are to open the portal, then open it you should. Alone." Soap looked somewhat dubious, but O'Malley continued unabashed. "The honour must be yours. We have no right to share it. Show us back to the foot of the staircase, where we will await your glorious return." "Glorious return, yes." Soap's voice was suddenly pensive. Pooley's head nodded enthusiastically, while at the same time his legs crossed and recrossed themselves. "So be it, then." Soap strode between the two men, and the light moved with him. O'Malley took one last look at the gigantic doors, chewed upon his bottom lip a moment, and then followed the receding Soap back along the death-black corridor. Soap's will-o'-the-wisp figure danced along ahead of them like a marsh phantom, weaving through the labyrinth of tunnels and finally into the huge central chamber. Peering up, O'Malley could make out the lights of 15 Sprite Street, a reassuring glow high above. Soap stood breathing heavily through his nose, his fists clenched, and his face a wax mask of sweat. Pooley was clutching desperately at his groin. O'Malley shifted nervously from one foot to the other. "You wait, then," said Soap suddenly. "Tonight is the night towards which the entire course of mankind's history has inevitably run. Tonight the ultimate mysteries will be known. Tonight the portal will be opened." Yes, said O'Malley. "We'll wait here, then." Soap's eyes had glazed. It was clear that he no longer saw Pooley or O'Malley. He had become focused both mentally and physically upon some distant point. His voice boomed on, filling the caverns, washing over the black rocks like some evil sonic wave. "Blessed be the gods of ancient earth, the dark ones and dwellers of the deep places. Great Rijinjipo, king of the world, lord of the nether regions, guardian of the inner secrets." O'Malley cupped his hands about his ears and muttered the rosary beneath his breath. Pooley, whose bladder was on the point of giving up the unequal struggle, rolled his eyes desperately. Without warning, Soap suddenly jerked forward. The two friends watched his glittering form flickering away into the darkness, his voice bouncing to and fro about the vaulted corridors, until finally the light died away, and the ghastly echoing cries became only a memory. O'Malley and Pooley stood a moment, faintly outlined by the light above. Slowly they turned to face one another, came to a joint decision which argued strongly for the authenticity of mental telepathy, and with one movement made for the stairs. Minutes later, on the corner of Sprite Street, O'Malley crouched, bent double, hands upon knees, gasping for breath. Pooley did little other than sigh deeply as he relieved himself through the railings into the Memorial Park. Between the gasps, gulps, and woodbine coughs, O'Malley uttered various curses, veiled blasphemies, and rows of impending violence directed solely and unswervingly towards Soap Distant. Pooley finished his ablutions to the accompaniment of one last, all-embracing sigh. Having zipped himself into respectability, he withdrew from his inner pocket a bottle of Soap's 50-year-old wine. "Shame to leave empty-handed," he said. "One for the road, John." "One indeed," the Irishman replied. He took a great pull and swallowed deeply. Pooley said, "What should we do? Soap is clearly mad." OMalley wiped his mouth and passed the bottle across. The full moon shone down upon them. In the distance, cars rolled over the flyover, and a late-night dog returning from some canine revelry loped across the road. All seemed so normal, so mundane, that their experience within the caverns was already taking on the nature of a bad dream. The clock on the memorial library struck 2. "If all that we saw was real, and not some shared vision, I am truly at a loss to know what action we should take. Soap is not harming anybody, though I'm certain that such an enormous maze of tunnels should be reported to the authorities, if only that they might be certified as safe. While I was down there, I had the feeling that most of Brentford could have sunk easily into them, still leaving room for half of the Chiswick High Road." "But what about the doors?" said Jim. "Surely one man could not open them alone. They looked pretty hefty. You don't really believe that they lead to the inner earth, do you?" OMalley shook his head. "We haven't a clue, although those crests, I've seen them before somewhere." All further conversation was, however, stifled by a low and ghastly rumble which came apparently from the lower end of Albany Road. Like a hideous subterranean clap of thunder, it rolled forward. From far along the street, lights began to blink on in upstairs windows, cats began to whine and dogs to bark. Pooley said, "It's an earthquake." OMalley crossed himself. Somewhere deep within the earth, a monstrous force was stirring. Great ripples ran up the paving stones of Sprite Street. A shockwave spread across the grass of the Memorial Park, stiffening the coarse blades into regimented roars. A great gasp, which issued from no human throat, shuddered up from the very bowels of the earth, building to an enormous crescendo. OMalley felt inclined to run, but his knees had turned to jelly. Pooley had assumed the fetal position. By now, Sprite Street was a blaze of light. Windows had been thrown up, front doors flung open. People issued into the street, clad in ludicrous pyjamas and absurd carpet slippers. Then, as rapidly as it had begun, the ominous rumblings ceased, seemed to pass away beneath them and fade away. The denizens of Sprite Street suddenly found themselves standing foolishly about the road in the middle of the night, shuffling their carpet slippers and feigning indifference to conceal their acute embarrassment. They backed into their respective abodes and quickly closed their front doors. The night was still again. The lights of Sprite Street dimmed away, and Pooley rose to his feet, patting dirt from his tweeds. "John," said he, "if you will excuse me, I am now going home to my bed, where I intend to remain for an indefinite period. I fear that the doings of this evening have forever destroyed my vitality, and that I am a broken man." "Certainly this has been an evening I should prefer to forget," said OMalley. With that he put his arm about his companion's shoulder, and the two friends wandered away into the night.